I conducted some research together with a colleague of mine, Jack Aiello from Rutgers University, where we tried to understand whether music can be helpful or harmful. And what we ultimately found was that my name is Manuel Gonzalez. I am an assistant professor in industrial organizational psychology at Montclair State University. So we conducted a laboratory experiment. We had people come into our lab to complete a series of different tasks. We had our participants complete something simple and something more complex. The simple task, they're just searching through a list of words, crossing off every word that has the letter A. The complex task is you're presented with a list of words and you have to recall back those words over several rounds. So something more easy, something more difficult. And we varied whether each person was listening to either a relatively simple piece of music, a relatively complex piece of music, or no music at all. And if you were listening to music as well, we varied how loud or soft it was. And what we ultimately found was that, as we suspected, it depends. That music can be helpful, especially when you're performing something relatively simple. So we found that people who listen to more complex music actually performed that simple A task a lot better than everybody else. But it can also be harmful. We found that music of any kind, regardless of the volume, the complexity, it actually was harmful for people who were doing the more complex work. In that study, we measured people's preferences for external stimulation. Essentially, if something else is going on in your environment, how prone are you to turn your attention to it, to disengage from what you're doing to that external thing? In this case, that's music. And we found that people who had these stronger external preferences for stimulation, actually music tended to be more harmful for them overall. They tended to over-rely on music. So even the simple tasks, they had a harder time doing it because their attention was drifting so much, or they were more prone to having their attention drift to that music. In terms of who is more prone to uh, drift toward music or over-rely on music, there are a few different factors at play. Some of it is who you are as a person. Some of it is also situational. In terms of who you are as a person, there are some personality traits that tend to be linked with this preference for stimulation, external stimulation. So, for example, if you're a very boredom-prone person, if you become bored very easily, you are more predisposed to try to find anything possible to kind of scratch the itch of boredom. If you are a very extroverted person, people who are extroverted have actually a high need to constantly be doing something and find sensation. There are also some more clinical types of traits associated with it. So, for example, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they're more prone to kind of have their attention pulled one way or another. So these are at least personal aspects that may influence whether music can be beneficial or harmful. Situationally, part of it may be how demanding the music is. So if it's very, well, mentally demanding, I'd say. So if it's music that you've never heard before, if it's music that has a lot of, in terms of how it's composed, a lot of complexity, a lot of varying tones and pitches. If there's a lot of, if it's lyrical music, it's probably more likely to pull your attention away because now you're not just listening to instrumentals, you're listening to also words and you're processing that at the same time. If music is intrusive rather than something that you're doing for yourself. For example, I listen to music all the time while I work, but I'm usually choosing the music that I'm listening to. If I'm in my office working and the person in the office next to me is blasting music of any kind, I'm probably thinking like, why are you doing this? This is annoying. So nothing to do with me. It's my thought about this person and this music becomes something unwanted. So there are other pieces of what makes music beneficial or harmful. It's not always a one-size-fits-all solution. So in terms of what types of work are more or less susceptible to the influences of music or where music can be beneficial or harmful, I wouldn't boil it down to entire jobs. There's a lot of variety in terms of what work someone does in a given job on a day-to-day. But in terms of the specific things that you do, some work is inherently more mentally taxing, such as, for example, um, writing reports or papers where there's a lot of, you're formulating thoughts, you're thinking through how to phrase things properly, you're thinking how to structure arguments, where there's a lot more active mental experimentation going on, I would say. In those contexts, music can be especially detrimental because it can kind of interfere with a lot of the mental Olympics that are kind of going on under the surface. If what you're doing also involves a lot of the verbal part of your brain, so again, writing, or if you're trying to formulate a presentation, for example, that's especially a case where lyrical music can be detrimental because the lyrics are conflicting with the verb, the what's going on in here as you're formulating arguments. So the words in your mind are conflicting with the words of the music. So there's more attentional conflict that can happen. If the work that you're doing is also something relatively new to you, so you're still kind of learning how to do something, you don't have the expertise to do it yet, where it's not really as automatic. In that case, especially, music can also be detrimental because it takes more thought to figure out how to do something. You're not used to it yet. So new tasks, tasks that are different, or you're going about something in a different way, or trying something in a different manner, different procedure, whatever it might be, their music can also be potentially more harmful because it's interfering with the amount of attention that you need to do something for the first, second, third time. Once you've learned it, once it feels more automatic, then yeah, it becomes simpler to you. The task becomes simpler to you. So when I talked earlier about simple or difficult tasks, that's a very relative concept. What might be easy for one person might be difficult to another. So it's about where your baseline is as well. There's been a lot of discussion about whether classical music in particular is beneficial for you. On the one hand, it could be because it's often instrumental in nature, so you don't have like a lot of lyrical conflict happening with what you're doing. On the other hand, there is also a lot of research that has debunked that it's specifically Mozart that can be beneficial. The very early research in this space looked at Mozart. They found that when you're doing a task, listening to Mozart before you do the task can actually be associated with better performance. And so from that from those one or two studies, the Mozart effect became really popular. Baby Mozart CDs came out, and people were saying if you have your children listen to Mozart, they're going to become smarter. There's this whole wave that came from these early findings. Research since then has actually had trouble replicating it or showing the same pattern. What instead research is suggesting is that it's not necessarily a specific artist or genre. It's how the music makes you feel that tends to matter much more. There's this theory now known as the mood arousal theory that listening to music elevates your mood, which in turn helps you work better, helps you perform better, it helps you do things faster and more efficiently. So it gets your body and your mind going. But mood is really the mechanism. So rather than pinpointing it to one artist, I would say instead consider whether you enjoy the music, whether it's something that can elevate your mood. Because if you don't like classical music, then you might actually be shooting yourself in the foot. You might think this is supposed to help me, but I hate it. And now because you're working with something that you don't enjoy in the background, it's actually being more harmful for your productivity. In terms of genres, generally speaking, instrumental music in general tends to be fairly beneficial, especially if it's music that you naturally tend to enjoy. I wouldn't necessarily pinpoint any given genre as inherently good or bad. It's some genres, if you just don't like it, it's probably still going to be a little painful to do your work with it. Like instrumental music, bluegrass is instrumental. I'm not a big fan of bluegrass. I'd probably suffer doing work listening to listening to banjos in the background. So music that is relatively instrumental because there's not as much demand placed on you from lyrics, for example. Music that you've also listened to a lot and that you have a lot of familiarity with. It seems ironic because it's very familiar to you, so you might think that you're more prone to drift toward it, but actually you're kind of used to it, and so it's the music is not as new, so it's not really pulling as heavily on your attention. For example, so I'm a raging metalhead, so I listen to heavy metal, which one might think is like very complex, at least compositionally, music all the time. I listen to it all the time while I'm doing my work. But it's music that I've listened to a lot, specific bands that I've listened to over and over again for years, years, years. And to me, they drift into the background because I've listened to it so much now that the novelty is gone, the pull is gone. I can still enjoy it, but I don't have to dwell in the music to still be able to enjoy it. I can still do other things and still enjoy it.